Thank you to everyone joining us today, and welcome to our joint webinar between the UN Global Compact Network Australia and Pillar 2 for the launch of our latest publication, the 2025 edition of Business Integration of Human Rights Due Diligence in Australia, Modern Slavery and Beyond. I'm Julia Burke, and I'm a Senior Coordinator in the Programs team at the UN Global Compact Network Australia. Before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which I'm dialing in from today, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd also like to extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us on the call today. I also encourage you all to share in the chat function which lands you are dialing in from as well. So in today's session, I'm going to start off by providing an overview of the new publication and the key updates in comparison to our previous 2023 edition. From there, I will hand over to Vanessa Zimmerman, CEO of Pillar 2 and the Chair of the Business and Human Rights Technical Advisory Group at the UNGCNA, to give a summary of the key regulatory environment updates included in the publication. Next, Rihanna Cermak, Associate Director at Pillar 2, will be presenting the analysis of the updated benchmarking included in the publication, as well as introduce the new section on building internal buy-in. Finally, we will hear from case study participants who have provided us their insights and analysis as part of the publication. So thank you to Helen Maisano, our Senior Director, Group Sustainability at Optus and Non-Executive Director at the UNGCNA, and Angela Crossland, Group General Manager of Sustainability at the GPT Group, for joining us today, as well as for your contributions to the publication. A few quick housekeeping items. Please keep in mind that this session will be recorded and distributed to those that have registered. And we will also be providing the opportunity for Q&A at the end of the session. So feel free to put any questions in the Q&A function on Zoom during the presentation, and we will be getting to them at the end of the call. Lastly, if you're having any technical troubles, please contact Lara Taylor, our Programs Coordinator, who's running the show behind the scenes today. She will send her email in the chat now, so just contact her if you have any issues with Zoom. So the purpose of today's webinar is to share with you all our newest publication, the 2025 edition of Business Integration of Human Rights Due Diligence in Australia, Modern Slavery and Beyond. Since the introduction of Australia's Modern Slavery Act in 2018, over 19,000 entities have prepared and filed a modern slavery statement with the online register established by the Australian government. However, progress in Australia made by businesses towards assessing and addressing broader adverse human rights impacts in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is less clear. This publication seeks to support Australian businesses to align their activities to assess and address any adverse human rights impacts with which they may be involved in line with the UNGPs. Building on our 2023 publication, this edition has been designed to provide practical examples of actions that businesses can take in line with the UNGPs. It will help businesses to expand their focus to assess and address broader human rights impacts in addition to modern slavery, as well as to assess more of their value chain. The publication is split into three main parts that mirror our initial 2023 edition. Part 1 provides an updated overview of the evolving global, regional, and local business and human rights legislative and policy landscape, as well as an overview of the increasing stakeholder expectations in relation to the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. Part 2 contains observations drawn from a 2024 review of public human rights-related disclosures by ASX 50 companies. It provides insights into approaches taken by Australian businesses in using human rights due diligence concepts in the UNGPs to integrate respect for human rights into management processes, and compares results to data collected in our 2023 publication. Part 3 provides practical guidance for businesses to support their human rights due diligence activities. It takes into account progress made by businesses in Australia, evolving stakeholder expectations, as well as the practical realities of establishing meaningful human rights due diligence processes. In this publication, we have provided brief explanations for topics that were explored in greater detail in the 2023 publication. In these instances, you'll see the symbol present on the slide, the blue rectangular box, which will guide you to the relevant sections in the earlier publication for more detail. This year's 2025 edition includes new sections that build upon the content from the 2023 edition, the first of these being a deep dive on ways to build internal buy-in for human rights due diligence, with guidance and practical actions that can be taken by businesses. Building a buy-in for human rights due diligence can involve navigating challenging discussions across the business, including in relation to resourcing and prioritisation. The publication outlines key practical steps to address these challenges and to build internal buy-in, which Rihanna will talk a bit more about later in the call. In addition to this deep dive section, we've also included case studies that reflect on key learnings from sustainability functions within UNGCNA participant companies and an independent sustainability advisor. They outline actions taken to build internal buy-in for human rights due diligence and support actions across the business. At the outset, I would like to thank UNGCNA participants Westpac, Queensland Investment Corporation, the GPT Group, Optus, as well as Siobhan Toohill for their contributions to the publication and willingness to share their insights with us. We will also hear more about these later in the call. I hope that you now all have a good sense of the contents of the publication and how it builds upon the previous edition. And I'd now like to hand over to Vanessa Zimmerman, who will give us an overview of the key regulatory environment updates. Over to you, Ness.
Thanks, Jules. It's really great to see this publication coming out today. We're 2 days on from the 14th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights being endorsed. And as Rihanna will take you through soon, it's really encouraging to see Australian companies improving how they are looking across all of their all of the risks they might have relating to all internationally recognised human rights beyond modern slavery, though obviously that is still very important. But it's really good to see that progress coming through. We can go to the next slide, especially because in the both domestically and globally, we are seeing now a much greater momentum around expectations on companies to look at all of the human rights impacts that they might have across their own operations and across their value chains. I'll go into the regulatory developments in just a moment, but just to again show you the very packed landscape that we have at the moment, where we see drivers coming in for companies to pay attention to their human rights risks from many different places. So we still absolutely do have the international standards in place. So the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct, which are now making their way into different regulatory developments, which I'll talk through, but also just by themselves are still being used by civil society groups, by investors, by governments and others, even where sometimes we are seeing some of the legislation starting to stall a little bit, which we'll talk through. We're seeing continued civil litigation and criminal cases being brought. Just in the last couple of months, we've seen cases being brought or decisions relating to Dyson. You might have seen regarding their supply chain in Malaysia. Apple, they were cases brought in France and Belgium relating to Apple's supply chain in the DRC. We've seen cases being brought against Australian mining companies abroad relating to legacy situations, joint ventures. We've seen a criminal case against a CEO, a former CEO and chairman of Lundin Mining over in Sweden relating to alleged essentially complicity in international crimes abroad. So we're seeing different types of cases being brought, and these are not kind of dissipating despite some of the issues that we're seeing in the geopolitical landscape. We're seeing these cases continue. Banks, investors, insurers continuing also to ask difficult questions. Several of the major Australian banks now have or are working on grievance mechanisms to hear complaints from community members or workers or others about the loaning, the kind of lending that those institutions might be doing, and asking those banks to think about what due diligence they're doing on institutional or other customers coming in. So you can just imagine, again, the questions that might start to come from these banks and other groups if they themselves are getting complaints about this and getting these questions. We know that standard setting industry associations are still going strong as well. You might have seen yesterday that there was a launch of the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy that does all, in addition to environmental aspects that that people should watch out for when companies are going for sustainable finance. There are minimum social standards that have a human rights element to them. There are several human rights related criteria, and we have seen that both in Australia and in Europe, and it will be important to see how sustainable finance institutions use that taxonomy here in Australia. But it does have human rights elements to it, and not, again, just on modern slavery, but on broader internationally recognised human rights as well. Advocacy campaigns are continuing, and we can see interconnections between major advocacy groups here in Australia and those overseas, in terms of making sure that there are interconnections between the campaigns that are being brought, and it means that there sometimes can be a very wide audience for these types of campaigns, and connections as well between civil society groups and investors and others who are all working towards corporate accountability. Non-judicial grievance mechanisms too. Many of you might be aware of the Australian National Contact Point, which is a non-judicial grievance mechanism that can hear human rights related complaints against Australian multinational companies. It is based in Commonwealth Treasury. Already this year, there have been 2 complaints against companies. Worldwide last year, there are around 21 complaints that were brought against companies in national contact points around the world, because each OECD country has one of these grievance mechanisms, and 20 of those 21 complaints were around human rights issues. So we are seeing an increase in the use of kind of mediation mechanisms as well as the courts. We can go to the next slide. The evolving legislative and policy landscape is really important. First of all, it shows us what might come down to us in Australia, but it also can be very important, even if certain laws are not coming here. If you're in a company with wide supply chains and value chains downstream as well, you might find that you're in the supply chain of a company that is caught by some of this legislation, and you might be getting questions about it. And just more broadly, as we see these pieces of legislation starting to be implemented and see guidance being created by governments and other parties, it can be a very helpful tool for you as a company to understand what might be expected of you in relation to human rights due diligence, what actually might be seen as acceptable due diligence, and also just to be very aware that this is an evolving landscape. So something that you thought might have been acceptable due diligence a few years ago, as we see these pieces of legislation evolving and we see the guidance coming out and external stakeholder expectations moving with them, then we can see that there might be a need to rethink some of the approaches that you're taking internally. So very quickly, there are a few different categories of these types of developments. So first of all, we do have the human rights due diligence legislation. This already exists in places like France and Switzerland and Norway. I'll move on on the next slide later to tell you about what is happening in the European Union, where there is currently a discussion around mandatory human rights due diligence there, and some potential changes to what was approved last year, but still a very, very live debate. Just last week, the South Korean Parliament saw the reintroduction of a bill around mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. It first came out in 2023. It's since been re-looked at, and it would require certain larger companies in South Korea to identify and act and address their human rights and environmental risks across global supply chains. So really interesting to see that in our region. And there's also been discussions around mandatory human rights due diligence in Thailand and Malaysia as well. Here in Australia, as many of you would know, the Australian government has agreed to consult on the concept of a mandatory modern slavery due diligence system requirement in our Modern Slavery Act. We'll see what happens in that regard. We know that civil society groups and others are also calling for broader mandatory human rights due diligence down here. There are import bans and other border measures. So many of you would be aware of the legislation in the United States that essentially is an import ban relating to one particular region, being the Xinjiang region in China, where companies essentially have to rebut, if they're wanting to bring goods into the country that have been made in Xinjiang, then they need to rebut a presumption that those goods were made with forced labor. to our knowledge, there have not been any companies that have been able to rebut that presumption where it is clear that the goods have actually come from Xinjiang. There have been goods that have been released because it's been proven they were not from Xinjiang. And then there are also situations where companies have taken their goods back to sell elsewhere. But to our knowledge, not one company has managed to rebut that presumption. There is also going to be an import ban in Europe. The EU recently adopted a forced labor regulation. It does not have the same kind of rebuttable presumption, and it doesn't relate to just one area. It relates to broadly to the whole globe, and it relates to things being brought into Europe as well as things being exported out of Europe. But the EU regulators will come up with a list of kind of higher risk jurisdictions which will support implementation of this import ban. We've heard conversations about import bans in the UK as well. There are also import bans in Canada and some other locations. So it is an important one to be aware of, and something that I know Australian stakeholders have been looking at as well. Then there is sustainability reporting legislation like the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. These are pieces of laws basically that require companies to report on the impact of their activities on the environment and society, and include reporting on internationally recognized human rights and what the company is doing about those risks as well. Then we have the modern slavery reporting legislation, which we know we have here. New Zealand has been looking at it. Canada and the UK also have this regulation, as well as California in the US. These pieces of legislation are evolving. We know that down here we did have the independent review of the Modern Slavery Act. We had the government's response, where we can see from that, as I said, they'll be looking at consulting on a due diligence system requirement. They will consult on penalties. They've agreed with multiple recommendations relating to tightening and in some cases strengthening the mandatory reporting criteria. So one to watch in the next year, particularly following the election, to see what happens there. And then some countries don't have mandatory human rights due diligence regulation, but they do have guidance material and policy documents that have been given to provide guidance to companies on how they can really implement human rights due diligence in a meaningful way. So one example is in Japan, where there are guidelines for companies in terms of their own operations and their value chains. And we do see Japanese companies taking these guidelines quite seriously. We can pop to the next slide. So if anybody has been active on LinkedIn in the business and human rights space, you will have seen this very odd concept of the omnibus being discussed. What has happened is that in February of this year, we heard about this announcement of an omnibus basically re-examining the legislation that had already been passed previously, being the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So CSDDD, which was for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, CSRD, which was the reporting regulation. There are many different reasons as to why this review is happening, a lot of different political and other considerations there. But it is happening at the moment. We don't expect an answer fully on all of this until probably the end of this year or early next year, because there are a lot of different EU organization institutions that do need to have a look at this and make sure that any changes will or won't be accepted. But I'll very quickly take you through the high level changes that are being contemplated. There was also something called the stop the clock proposal as part of the omnibus. So there are substantive changes that are being considered that I'll take you through in a second. But the stop the clock proposal, which actually has already been accepted, was basically to say, while all of this is being looked at, that the clock would be stopped on implementation of and the requirement to kind of implement these pieces of regulation until there was more clarity. So what it means is that at least until the middle of 2027, no company is going to have to apply CSDDD, and there are also various rules relating to that on the CSRD. So really quickly, the CSRD as it currently stands means that in-scope companies have to report on their sustainability impacts, risks and opportunities that are material from a double materiality perspective. And the double materiality includes looking at impacts on people and the environment, And as part of looking at that, companies are expected to consider the most severe human rights impacts that they could be involved in using concepts from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. The Omnibus package proposed changes include a significant reduction in the number of reporting companies that would actually be covered, some clarification and simplification of the standards that underpin the reporting requirements, and some other changes as well relating to sector-specific standards. The CSDDD, so the Mandatory Human Rights Due Diligence Directive, and what deals with that element. The original, and I'm really simplifying here, but the original scope meant that in-scope companies had to implement human rights and environmental due diligence for their operations, subsidiaries, and business partners where related to their chains of activity. So not just to their first tier. There was civil liability in there as well, which meant that every EU state had to bring in civil liability. And there were also quite specific elements around certain parts of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. What we're seeing now in the Omnibus is that there would be a limit to due diligence on direct suppliers, except for in certain situations. There would be a limit on the types of information that in-scope companies could ask from smaller suppliers. It would remove the need for EU-level civil liability. Each state would decide themselves if they would have civil liability. But really importantly, what hasn't changed in the suggested review are key fundamental elements of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which are still in there to some extent, but there will be a lot of debate and discussion around this. So really just one to watch as you're thinking about whether you might be subjected to this as a company yourself, or if some of your suppliers or customers might be, and also to think about what may eventually come down here once these pieces of regulation are finalised in the EU. But I'll pass on to Rihanna to tell us what is happening in the Australian landscape. Thanks, Rihanna.
Excellent. Thank you, Vanessa. So as Julia mentioned earlier, in 2023, we undertook a benchmarking of ASX 50 companies reporting on human rights due diligence beyond freedom from modern slavery. We've undertaken the same review towards the end of last year for the publication this year. And it's been interesting, some of the findings which we're excited to showcase today. I think we can go to the next slide now. So we essentially looked at two different buckets of information that the companies were reporting on. So first, we looked at whether companies were starting to go beyond a focus on modern slavery to also take broader action on human rights risk management more broadly, beyond the right to freedom from modern slavery. The second bucket that we looked at was whether companies are starting to use human rights due diligence concepts to describe their actions taken to assess and address modern slavery. What we looked at here was based on publicly available information, and we looked at sources, for example, modern slavery statements, sustainability reports, and annual reports to see what companies were talking about in relation to these two areas. Before we move to the next slide and start to talk through some of the results, we note that these are some of the largest companies in Australia, so the ASX 50, and it does have some of a mix of different types of companies, but of course there's many companies outside the ASX 50 that are also implementing actions and starting to make change in this area, but we've looked at some of those companies to get an example of some of the action that's starting to be taken. So I think we can move to the next slide. So we were very pleased to see an increase across all of the indicators that we looked at across all areas of our review. But starting off with a public policy commitment to respect human rights, so one of the core elements of the UN Guiding Principles. And we were pleased to see that between 2023 and our review in 2024, that there was an increase from 56% to 64%. What we really looked at here was that there was an explicit commitment to respect all internationally recognised human rights in line with the UN Guiding Principles expectations, and also reference to some of the key other international instruments such as the ILO core conventions, the International Bill of Rights, the UN Guiding Principles, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For companies that scored a no for this one, there was potentially some reference to particular rights. So for example, freedom of association or references to modern slavery, but not that core and key reference to internationally recognised human rights more broadly.
The next one we looked at was inclusion of human rights as a material topic in ESG-focused materiality assessments. And this links a lot with what Vanessa talked through before on CSRD and some of the evolving legislation in this space. But we definitely saw a jump from 2023 to 2024 of the companies that do include human rights specifically as a material topic in their materiality assessments. There were, in our review, we did also look at companies that had included some topics related to human rights as a material topic. So, for example, diversity or modern slavery or specific topics like that. But to receive the kind of yes score or the 48%, we were looking at human rights very specifically. The next one, looking at salient human rights issues. So again, we saw an increase from 24% to 32%. And for this one, we were looking at companies that conducted a salient human rights issues assessment, broadly looking at across their value chain and looking at all internationally recognised human rights. There were companies, again, that looked at more narrow issues. So we did see examples of companies that were looking at modern slavery issues and narrowing down there, but we were really looking at companies that had started to do those broader salient human rights issues assessments. And I think we can go to the next slide. The next one was looking at broadly public reporting on human rights risks or impacts beyond modern slavery. Typically, those companies that did have evidence of undertaking salient human rights issues assessments or some of that broader work typically did score better on this as well, as they would start to report on some of the actions that they were taking. But we did see that other companies as well, so up to 48% in our 2024 review of the ASX 50, were providing details on the human rights risks or impacts that they might be involved with beyond those involved in the definition of modern slavery. And then finally, one of the key elements which really ties in to the building buy-in piece, which we'll talk through shortly, was looking at cross-functional working groups focusing on human rights beyond modern slavery. So a lot of Australian companies we know have working groups dedicated to modern slavery very specifically, but we were pleased to see a small increase on cross-functional working groups that focused on human rights more broadly beyond modern slavery. And established kind of that key collaborative working group to coordinate responses within companies. That's still one of the areas where there is lower scoring. So in 2024, still only 28% of the ASX 50 had reported on setting up these types of groups. But we do know that is such a critical area of kind of getting that, building that buy-in and getting that coordination and collaboration across teams. So we'll just move to the next slide. Now we're looking at using human rights due diligence concepts to describe actions taken to assess and address modern slavery risks. And one that we've seen a significant uptick in use and general use of is the UNGPs continuum of involvement in modern slavery reporting. So that's looking at the involvement that a company has with a human rights harm. So whether it's cause, contribute, or directly linked to, and we've seen a significant uptick in companies that are starting to use those terms to consider how they might be involved in modern slavery harm and using it in their modern slavery reporting specifically. The next one that we looked at was reporting on modern slavery risks relating to downstream value chains. And with that, we were really looking at whether companies were starting to look beyond supply chains and operations to some of those customer or client relationships to start to look at modern slavery risks there. And we did see, particularly in the financial services sector, some of those companies starting to undertake or report on how they look at modern slavery risks relating to their downstream value chains, in line with the UNGP's expectation that human rights due diligence covers the whole value chain, and in this case, including the right to freedom from modern slavery. And might move to the next slide. So on building internal buy-in, as Julia mentioned earlier, in this year's publication, we really wanted to highlight the importance of building buy-in for human rights due diligence. So we do a lot of work at Pillar 2, and the Global Compact Network Australia does as well, with companies and practitioners within companies that focus on human rights day in, day out, and it's a core part of their work. But we all know that within companies, big or small, getting that critical buy-in and getting those around you from different teams to understand why it's important, what the risks are, and what the company should be doing and what it means to them personally can be so critical to get human rights due diligence activities effectively implemented. So I might take us to the next page. So you can read in our publication more under each of these, but we included some examples of different elements that can help to build internal buy-in. And I want to note that big or small, SME or large multinational business, these principles apply to businesses of all size. Regardless of sector and size, they will be important to think about as you start to implement some of these actions. And similarly, for companies that are newer to the human rights due diligence space, may have experience in modern slavery, but less in broader human rights due diligence, may just be starting out with both. Some of these back to basic principles of building buy-in can be so critical to help get that message across internally. So the first one that we looked at was ensuring that senior executives and board members are fully informed about your business's human rights risks and the evolving expectations, as Vanessa took us through earlier, and including those that go beyond modern slavery risk management. So as Vanessa took us through earlier with the developments globally, some of those expectations that we are starting to see increasingly flowing to companies here in Australia, even if not directly covered, and ensuring that senior executives and board members are equipped to respond to these evolving expectations. Helen and Angela will talk a little bit internally about ways that they've done it within their companies shortly, but some of the examples that we've seen that are helpful and you can read more about in the publication are things like periodic briefings to the board and executive leadership team on human rights, expectations, responsibilities, and what it means for the particular business. We're increasingly seeing companies ask for these types of briefings, which is positive to see, and it's something that definitely helps to build that buy-in from the top. And also dedicated agenda items in board committee meetings. So specific board committees that are particularly relevant to human rights, involving, where possible, dedicated agenda items relating to the company's human rights due diligence activities or key risks to help drive some of that discussion and engagement at the more senior level. The next one, which I covered earlier as well, around establishing internal channels for cross-functional collaboration and proactively identifying change management opportunities where barriers might exist. This one has a couple of elements here, but really looking at things like those cross-functional human rights working groups or engagement with teams outside of the core human rights, modern slavery or sustainability teams where these responsibilities often sit, and seeing where that deeper engagement can work across the business. The next is looking at building capacity across the business through broader awareness raising and targeted training programs. So some of the examples that we give here is using existing policies to raise awareness with teams, making use of things like the internal intranet and existing activities or engagements. What we see a lot of companies doing is using Human Rights Day, for example, as a day to raise awareness internally and bringing practical examples of what the company is doing or kind of risks and areas for discussion across broader team members. Often as well, short human rights modules for all staff, either at an induction stage or ongoing as an e-learning or in-person training. And then also what we do see as critical going forward for companies as they start to evolve their approach to really look at that targeted training for key functions that are relevant to the risk areas of a company. So I'm sure most people on this call who have done some modern slavery work will have engaged a lot with procurement, and we'll hear a little bit more about engagement as well from Helen and Angela later, but kind of those key teams that might be relevant to your company's human rights risk profile. The next one is looking at drawing on existing knowledge and expertise across the business. And again, this is something where we see that there are often within companies a lot of teams that are doing human rights work or related work, but not necessarily calling it human rights. So for example, in the mining space, this might be community relations teams, or in the energy space as well. Again, it might be procurement teams sending out supplier assessment questionnaires and assessing some of these areas, human resources teams, which work very hard to in relation to employees. But a lot of these teams don't necessarily share the human rights language or really think of what they're doing as human rights. But I think drawing some of those learnings that you can get from those teams and actively involving them in designing the processes to ensure that they are fit for purpose, and the teams that will end up using these processes and implementing them in practice understand them and have essentially bought into them. The final one is engaging strategically with internal stakeholders to maximise engagement and outcomes. And I think this is one where there's a lot of different ways that companies can do this, and we've seen some successful ways being through that cross-functional working group, bringing different key internal stakeholders into those meetings at different points in time to ensure that they remain engaged and aware, but also strategically identifying potential human rights allies or champions across the business to build strong collaborative relationships with them. So, for example, within different functions or teams, if there's a key person who you've worked with in the past who has been particularly engaged and particularly aware of some of the human rights risks and really wants to make change, jumping on that and really engaging with them more and helping them to equip themselves, and also helping them to drive the human rights awareness and also activities more broadly. And that leads us very nicely to our interview with Helen from Optus and Angela from GPT Group. So we're very lucky today to have on the line two of the UNGCNA participants who participated in the case studies for the publication. And we have a couple of questions for Helen and Angela before we move to a broader Q&A. And very, very happy to hear from them today. But before we kick off, Helen, Angela, if you'd just like to introduce yourself for 5 seconds each. I know Julia did right at the start, but just so that everyone is aware of yourself and your company. So I'll start with Helen.
Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. I'm Senior Director of Sustainability at Optus, and that covers environment, social impact, human rights, modern slavery, staff engagement initiatives, and also some of our disaster response work. So it's quite a broad area, and we're a very small team. I think we're 7 people in total. Over to you, Angela.
Thanks.
Thanks, Helen. My name's Angela Crossland. I'm dialing in from Gadigal country today. My remit, I look after corporate sustainability. And previously I've come from the nonprofit sector. So I guess coming into a corporate space with that practical experience of working with people where their human rights are really at risk, or they're needing, immediate support for that. It's been quite valuable to support businesses in understanding what that can look and feel like and what the impacts of that work is. So my role encompasses working with a lot of different stakeholders across the business to support modern slavery risk management, First Nations engagement, and I guess our broader approach to human rights.
Thanks, Angela. Thanks, Helen. So starting off with a question for Helen. So you mentioned that there's a lot of hats that you wear in your role and kind of a lot of things that you cover, and no one person or 7 people in your team can do it all. So we know that kind of building that buy-in with internal stakeholders is critical. Who have been some of the internal stakeholders at Optus that have been kind of critical to help you drive forward some of the implementation of human rights due diligence?
Well, I think it's been a range of people. And when we started our work in the modern slavery space, which was new for us, it was about trying to find the right stakeholders. And we established a working group, a modern slavery working group, which I know other companies have done. It sounds easy. It's not as simple to do, because you do need to educate people. I had people, and I still do have people, that say, what do you mean by modern slavery, and what human rights are we talking about? And so we worked very closely with procurement. They have been part of the journey for us from the beginning, from the outset. And but we also include our people from risk. We have legal, we have our contact centres, retail, people and culture. We also have a representative from our enterprise business. And so they all play, I guess, different functions and look at modern slavery and human rights through different lenses. And it was important that when we established that group is, what are we here to do? And where are our risks? And so, in our very early days, it was, we were trying to figure that out. And developing an action plan so you could identify what are some of the immediate things that we could change, and what are some of the more longer term processes, systems, policies that need to change. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to share some news today, and some of you may have seen this already in the media. Optus has reached a settlement with the ACCC, and this has arisen from mis-selling and inappropriate sales practices that happened between 2019 and 2023. And all I can say is that what happened there, it was appalling. It was terrible. Even despite all the right intentions that Optus has and the right policies, mistakes happen. And I think it affects all businesses in some way or another. And this is where what you say and what you do, really peeling the onion, understanding where do the human rights impacts exist, and do your processes, incentives for sales teams, and anything else that links to that, are they all supporting the end goal? Are they protecting the customer from harm? And so no one wants a crisis. None of us want a crisis in our company. But sometimes a crisis, when that happens, it makes everyone go, okay, what went wrong? What did we do wrong? Let's unpack this further. And, we own the mistake that we made, but we have also done a lot of work to really drill down and understand where in the business did it go wrong? What do we need to improve? Because in the end, it's the vulnerable person at the end. It's the harm that's done to someone. And that's what we want to avoid. So that is another piece of work, which is, in a way, a crisis actually drives change as well. And so in one way, that is something that we as a business are really tackling at the moment, have set up dedicated teams to look at all that, as well as implement remediation to those affected. So we're learning a lot through this process. We're learning around, what we could do better and making those changes. Having a new CEO is certainly helping, and Stephen is very keen to ensure that this never happens again. But I guess I'm giving you that as a backdrop in terms of, you can have all the right intentions and you have the working groups with all the relevant people, but sometimes things do go wrong, and you need to then go back in and go, what happened here? Own it, be transparent about it, and fix it, and ensure that it doesn't happen. So the other thing that we did was we did conduct a workplace conditions assessment recently with about 5 suppliers across a number of sites. And that WCA audit aligned very much with our supplier code of conduct. And that supplier code of conduct is really what we expect our suppliers to abide to. And the audit results of that has helped us also further understand, are they operating at a standard that we expect? And then as a working group and as our action plan, what are those actions to remediate and improve? So I hope that answers the question, Rhianna.
It does. Thank you, Helen. And I think thank you as well for sharing some of the recent challenges. And I think, as you said, it always is good to use those opportunities to kind of rethink and dig deeper. But it also, I think, why one of the good things about the UN Guiding Principles concept of human rights due diligence being ongoing and kind of, we often speak to companies who are like, and now are we finished? But unfortunately, with human rights, we are talking about people, so they'll never be kind of an absolutely finished, and it's always important to use these opportunities. So thank you, Helen. Just quickly building on that, Helen, and then I'll turn to a question for Angela. But you mentioned the new CEO as well, but we've saw in your case study in the publication, which people can read, some of that engagement with senior management and senior leadership to help drive the implementation. In what ways have you at Optus approached that engagement over the years with key members of the executive level or board level to drive some of those activities?
The board and the executives, especially the board, want to know, what are the risks? Where are the risks? So I think I think one of the things that we did do when we started was try and appreciate, we have so many suppliers, thousands of suppliers, understanding the categories of risk for us, and who are the suppliers that sit under those, and what could potentially happen, I think is an important first step. And then taking that to the board and our executive team so that they can understand what those risks are. That helps set up the conversation to have those deeper questions. And the board have been particularly supportive around and asking the right questions, and particularly supportive in helping fast track some audit work that we needed done, for example. So I think it's important that you have a bottom-up approach, with your working group and people across the business that represent all different levels across the business, because this is owned, human rights is owned by the business. It doesn't just sit with sustainability and a team that has to produce reports. It sits across the business. But the top-down approach is also very critical. And so we've also taken our board through, education around what is modern slavery, what are our human rights risks, and we went through a salient risk assessment and identified 6 areas of human rights risks, one of which was avoiding, adverse human rights impacts on the communities and where we operate. And yet I'm giving an example of where we didn't do that very well, and we're addressing that. So I think that engagement with the board needs to be, they need to understand where those risks are. And I've always found our board quite receptive to that, and then asking, well, where are our gaps? What do we need to change? Where do we need to improve? And so that's been quite helpful. And we take that approach. We present our action plan and our modern slavery statement, as well as how we've progressed against our action plan on an annual basis to our board and our executive committee. And we've always found that engagement works quite well.
Thank you so much, Helen. No, it's very important, as you said, to kind of have the bottom-up approach and the people on the ground really doing the work, but also that top-down buy-in, which turns me to Angela as well. So how important at GPT have you found building the internal buy-in with senior leadership, and how have you approached this across the years at your organisation?
I think picking up on what Helen was talking about, that maturity level in an organisation is something that I guess you continually are responsible for testing when you're in a function like ours, where you're, I guess, leading that reporting on risk to senior leaders and executive, and you're monitoring for that. So sometimes I feel like we've really transformed our maturity and we're at this top end of the curve, and then things can change, and you realize that you've really got to ramp up that focus on education again. So I guess, Helen, to some of the points you just made, that is an ongoing process, like you said, where you are really constantly trying to assess the understanding of the business, of what those risks to people are that your business presents, alongside the risks to business that they're so traditionally focused on. One of the things that we've seen, so similar to what Helen spoke about, I guess, in our business. So GPT is a property company, or not a chat GPT, but now people know what our acronym is. So we own and manage and develop property all around Australia. So obviously that is traditional country. So I think having those practical connections to where your business products really impact on human rights directly, it provides the avenue to start talking about human rights with your business, where maybe human rights seems like a bit more of an abstract concept to your operation, or something that feels perhaps a bit academic, or something that exists in a legal space. So I found that when working with senior leaders, when working with the board, but also working with, as Helen said, people across the whole business, really connecting the dots to those ways that your organisation directly impacts on people and human rights, means that that people start to see and identify those opportunities for more practical due diligence. And so then I guess that reporting and communication up the chain to the business is more accurate, because you're reflecting the effectiveness of controls, and you're able to talk about actions that the business is taking alongside grievances, and you're not just focusing on those grievances once they hit a point that they are escalated to that board level.
Thank you, Angela. Unfortunately, I think we only have time for maybe one or two more questions, because the conversation has been so rich so far. But one more for you, Angela, and I think this builds a lot from what you were just talking about in relation to kind of that bringing it home and making it accessible for some of these key teams and people at a senior and across the business level. So one of the key areas you talked about in your case study, which I think was really helpful, and I believe would be helpful for a lot of people on this call when they get to read the publication, is talking about how we often use kind of human rights language and concepts that really help us human rights practitioners have an aligned sense of what we're really doing, but it can create challenges when getting that buy-in if other people in the business don't understand the language or don't align with the concepts. How have you navigated this particular issue at GPT?
So what we've seen, and I guess it's kind of to my point before, drawing the line to the practical things that we're already doing. So when we did our salience assessment, I guess it gave us more direction on what those key salient issues are for our business, and rather than coming to people with dare I say, human rights jargon with this cohort, but it was
jargon?
Yeah.
Do we have too many acronyms, perhaps?
And we all have acronyms in our own little worlds, don't we? In our organizations and in the areas that we are the kind of the expert in. So we've really looked at, I guess, the existing controls and risk management actions that we already have in place, and tried and brought people's attention to that, to show them, what we're doing well, and it brings it to life. So you're able to have a more genuine discussion about how things could present. And I think that really takes the heat out of the concept of human rights, or what you said before, Helen, people's understanding of modern slavery. It's a alarming term for still a lot of stakeholders, and they think, oh, that's so far away from us here in Australia. But actually, these are really real things that happen in any organisation, regardless of the size, and being aware of how you impact on people. It helps you manage reputational risk. It helps you build positive staff engagement, and it of course helps you with your customer engagement and outcomes. So yeah, I think translating your efforts into just everyday language goes a long way.
Thank you so much, Angela and Helen. I'm so sad to say that we need to wrap up the discussion now. We could probably talk all day, and there's endless challenges and learnings in this space, but thank you so much for taking the time today and for providing the case studies for the publication, which we hope everyone on this call gets an opportunity to read and share, because they are very valuable resources to hear from companies like Optus and GBT, how they are tackling some of these issues. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I think we're going to just do very, very quick questions. A couple have come in, and thank you to Rihanna as well, and to Helen and Angela. We've just got, I've answered a couple of them in the actual Q&A box, but we've just got one in our 5 minutes that I might come to Helen and Angela on really quickly. So the question is, how can you engage board and senior leadership on human rights, the top-down piece, when they just don't seem interested? Can you share any strategies? And I'm going to ask each of you just in 1 minute only to say, how do you think you can get senior leadership attention on the broader human rights topic, including kind of human rights salient issues discussions, not modern slavery? I'm going to challenge you to think about, how do you get their attention? Now, Angela's just already given us some very good tips, and Helen too, about translating this, about making it practical, about making them understand the risks. I think what we've seen in our work is that if there's a regulatory development that you can use as a bit of a hook, if there is, to Helen's point before, if there's some kind of crisis that impacts on your own company, but also a peer, that can also be a very good way to get the senior leadership's attention. Sometimes one of them will have a particular personal connection to something, or has been out to a site or a factory or something else and is interested about this and can be a champion. But more than anything, and to Helen's point again, I think having really punchy discussions where they understand what the risks are and what should keep them up at night, not speaking to them for 2 hours, but just a very quick, sometimes even a 40 or 30 minute presentation that just really gets their attention. But Helen, really quickly over to you. Any ideas to get the board's attention on human, or the EXCO on human rights, not just modern slavery?
Look, I think legislation helps a lot. It certainly means that, they need to look at this. A crisis also helps. So I think that where you can leverage other examples of companies that have had to go through a crisis and say, this could happen to us, especially if you've done your risk assessment, it could reinforce that. I think you've got to find in your toolbox all different ways, all different things that you can leverage that's going to get the message across.
Thanks, Helen. Angela, in 1 minute, how do we get across the message?
I think the stakeholder we haven't spoken about is customers and investors as a customer group. So yeah, I guess depending on the type of organization you are, your investors hold a lot of power over what your disclosures are and where you prioritize action. And so I would certainly look at what the queries are that your organization is getting from your customers or your investors, and how that impacts on your focus of work in this space, and looking at those regulatory guidance materials, alongside it, because there's been a big increase in the international investor community on their understanding and awareness of what human rights risks look like at a practical level for organizations, and sustainability is a big one.
Thank you. And I think, having a chairperson being asked a really tricky, broader human rights question or something about their salient human rights issues does absolutely, I think, help to focus issues, as well as customers and others, including corporate customers, asking questions. Thank you so much. We need to wrap up. A massive thank you to everybody who was involved in this publication, to Angela and Helen as well. I just wanted to, in the last minute, obviously there is huge geopolitical upheaval at the moment and all sorts of things happening around the world. What we are seeing, though, from the companies that we work with across the globe is that the human rights work is actually still being done. It might be a bit quieter in some places. People may In some countries, as you might imagine, even, you know, team names are being changed, things like that in the US, but we are seeing work being done. We're seeing US companies still hiring for human rights people. We're seeing companies in Europe trying to figure out mandatory human rights due diligence and using what they have available to them and using the international standards that we have, because the baseline is if you're using the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and other related international standards, hopefully at least you've got those foundations in place, whatever happens in this area. So a big thank you, a big endorsement or encouragement for people to read the publication, but also to try and attend the Regional Business and Human Rights Forum that UNGCNA is co-hosting in August of this year, and Julia will send some information out around that. But a big thank you to everyone for joining today.
Yes, so just like to reiterate the thanks for everyone joining today. The publication is now live on the website, and we'll have a link in the chat to that as well now. And I'd also just like to extend thanks to some of the UNGCNA team, including Katie Shavin, our Senior Manager of Business and Human Rights, as well as interns Angelina Ocampo and Alana Marinelli for their contributions to the publication as well. Another massive thank you to the Pillar 2 team for your work as part of the collaboration. So to Vanessa and Rihanna on the call, as well as Elise Milroy, advisor at Pillar 2, for all of your hard work putting this piece of work together with us. And thank you again to the case study participants, Westpac, QIC, the GPT Group and Optus, and Siobhan Toohill, as well as Helen and Angela for joining and sharing insights today. It has been really great to hear from both of you. I'll make this really quick. I would just like to talk about some other exciting events we have coming up. So like Vanessa mentioned, the Regional Forum on Business and Human Rights, you can see on the screen. This inaugural forum in our region will bring together a broad range of stakeholders to strengthen business practices and connect on how businesses manage their value chains across the region. There's a link in the chat for the website, which also has a link to sign up for updates. But I can say registration will be opening very, very, very soon. So I'd encourage you all to sign up for those updates if you haven't already, and keep eyes on your inbox to see the registrations opening. And finally, registrations are also now open for our flagship conference for 2026, Uniting Business Live, with super early bird rates available before the 31st of July. So a link is also sent in the chat where you can find more information about that, and we really encourage you to take advantage of these super early bird deals while they are still available. Thanks again for everyone joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.